I will be talking to you about step 5 today, the projection of the outcomes for your policy, for proposed policy. So let's do a quick recap of steps 1 through 4. So step 1 was to define the problem, and that is your reason for the new policy. Step 2 is to assemble the evidence, and that is your gathering of data, your conducting of your research. Step 3 will be to construct alternatives, which is a list of options that you have to solve the problem. Step 4 would be to select the criteria, which are the standards that you will use to judge the goodness of your projected policy. And step 5 would be the projecting of outcomes or impacts. So going back to the list constructed in step 3, we want to examine all of the possible outcomes for those alternatives. It is important to note that this step is often the one that is excluded or skipped over, so a word of advice from the author is to just do it. And we can never, although policy is about fixing the future, we can never be certain about how events will play out. So this is our way of being realistic and understanding the way that our policy will affect people's lives, either for better or worse. There is a 59-49 principle that I want to talk about, and with this principle, it states that we treat 51% of our confidence in our proposed policy as 100%, which can cause us to mislead ourselves. So in addition to our own common sense, we need to have an insight into our policies. So one way that we can do that is by using metaphors. And with metaphors, it gives us insight into the back end of understandings that drive our policy. So an example would be the quotation of, "This piece of the world works as a production system," end quote. So that is a qualitative insight into a causal relationship that metaphors can often provide for us. Secondly, we want to look at policy as a social science, and that is answering the questions, for example, does model X of this piece of the world, is it realistic? So it's useful in identifying problems and trends. Third, we want to look for or come up with and construct multiple models, and that is the idea that we are looking for the best possible way, the best possible model of how we can structure our policy. And then we also need to take into consideration initial conditions, and that is that what are the current facts, what is currently in place. So again, let me reiterate that what are the facts that are currently in place. Try not to think of your policy as achieving only general outcomes, but consider the magnitude. So instead of saying something like, we expect this policy to reduce the number of teen pregnancies in this county, you can say, we expect this policy to reduce by 1 to 300 the number of teenage pregnancies per year within the next 5 years. So it's a little bit more clear, and it gives a measurable goal. Quite often, critics will say, well, you have no evidence to prove that this policy will work. And our counter-argument is usually, well, you have no evidence to prove that it won't work. So instead of engaging in that argument, we can use a break-even estimate and address the problem of uncertainty. So setting justifications that are based on as low as reasonably possible can help us overcome those critics. So one, you want to set a minimum acceptable effectiveness in which you will just ask yourself, what does this policy need to accomplish in order for me to justify $1 million being spent, or for me to justify the change? Second, you want to see if you can possibly change the old policy and just make revisions or tweaks to produce a level of effectiveness. Then you want to see how likely is the process for improvement going to produce a break-even effectiveness. And then you want to estimate the possibility of failure and the political cost that you will have to when you accept that failure. We also need to confront the problem of optimism, and that is that we feel like our policy is the best policy and it's going to work out and people are going to fall for it and it's going to make life better. So a way to overcome this problem is to do scenario writing. And with scenario writing, you write out scenarios that can cause a proposal that might cause a proposal to succeed or fail. And in doing so, you want to let your imagination run a little bit so that you can have a chance to think of the most dangerous possibilities. And that, in a sense, will help you come up with ways or see insight into how this policy might affect someone negatively, or the criticisms or the negative that might come along with the policy. And also, we want to address the factor of undesirable side effects. Um, so, in this sense, you want to say, if I actually get people to follow my advice, what is the worst that can happen to them if I'm wrong? How will this impact them? What's the worst thing that can come out of it? So, when it comes to dealing with problems in the future, at some time and point, it would be a good idea to sit back and do a fair assessment of all the scenarios that you have written down and look at both good and bad qualities. A good way to do that is to use the outcomes matrix, which an example is here for you, where you list alternatives and then you can rate the outcomes from low to medium to high. It's a good way to simplify the process so you can actually see it written down, and it can be shared with your team members or any outside observers that you may want opinions from. So to conclude with step 5, the projection outcome is a critical step in policy analysis. It's the realistic projection of what your proposal will do and how it will affect the future. Thank you guys, and I'll see you on Thursday.